I'm Megan Gleason.
I'm Dan Boyd.
Welcome to another episode of Rounding Up the Roundhouse.
If you enjoy our podcast, please like and subscribe and consider becoming a digital subscriber to the Albuquerque Journal to help us bring you more content like this. You can find this episode and all of our podcasts on the Albuquerque Journal website, abqjournal.com, as well as YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. See the show notes for a discount code on a digital subscription. Thank you for supporting the Albuquerque Journal, New Mexico's leading news.
It's been a while. We've gotten some sleep since the end of the session. Brains are functioning again.
Yeah, it almost seems like a dream at this point, but we wanted to come back and do another episode today. Friday was the deadline for Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham to act on bills that were passed during the session, and it was a busy day, so we wanted to kind of give a little recap of all the bill signings and vetoes and kind of what that all means.
Yeah, in the last time we recorded an episode, we were just talking about it was day 59. It was Friday morning. There was a little over 24 hours left in the session, and it was a pretty crazy last day. There was a mass shooting in Las Cruces that happened Friday evening, and then we saw a House override motion that passed only on the House, not in the Senate, and then finally the governor's news conference kind of summing up the session, and a lot of disappointment with the lack of movement on crime bills, which was really a big focus of this session, is public safety. We were coming off of a 5-hour special session that really not much got done, and so coming into this session, that was the goal. And the governor came out a little disappointed, maybe more than a little, but disappointed with what legislators did, and we saw that again in the bill signings that happened Friday or didn't happen.
Yeah, for people who don't follow it as closely, the governor usually has 20 days after a session to act on most of the bills passed. There's sometimes if a bill is passed earlier in the session, she has an earlier deadline, but the bulk of the bills, and I think there were 194 bills passed this year by both the House and the Senate, so she had 20 days, to act on those, and we did see, as you mentioned, Megan, kind of a carryover. Even at the end of the session, I think legislators were said it was a pretty productive session and proud of their accomplishments, and the governor, not as much so, and that carried over. We saw on Friday the governor vetoing 16 bills on the last day of the bill signing, and clearly, expressed her displeasure with legislators in some of those veto messages, kind of saying that they had focused on issues she didn't believe were as important as some of the crime and public safety issues that she wanted and that weren't passed by the legislature.
Yeah. She ended up vetoing 18 bills total, and she had another 17 bills that were pocket vetoed. But it was interesting in some of the bill vetoes, which included making the tortilla the state bread and creating new specialty license plates for lowriders and New Mexico United Soccer Team. She had the same veto message for those three bills, and she said these are frivolous issues. We've seen a lot of stuff happening in New Mexico, and we need to hold our legislators accountable. We need to get more serious work done during the sessions instead of spending these hours on these bills. And there were pretty long conversations around some of those bills. I mean, I remember I sat in on a very long, hours-long House debate about the state tortilla bill, and it was fun and lighthearted and kind of some of the more joyful moments of the legislature where things can get really tense at the end run there. But the governor said we need to get more serious things done, and she really pointed to crime as, I wish you would pass more crime bills. I think she referenced a housing bill, and she again mentioned frustration that a lot of these bills never even got the light of day. They never had debate. They didn't make it to committees. They didn't make it to the floor. She really slammed down on legislators in her veto messages of those bills.
Yeah, and I think to put that kind of in context, I mean, obviously this was her last 60-day session here at the Roundhouse. She still has one more 30-day session next year, but it's kind of continuing this trend of her kind of butting heads with legislators, especially over crime and public safety issues. But there has been talk, she mentioned wanting to call legislators back for a special session this year. And I'll be intrigued now, with some of these vetoes and the way they're received, kind of the impact those have on a special session and legislators' attitude toward that. And then also going into her final 30-day session, I think we've already seen a little bit of tension between even other Democrats in the legislature and the governor. And I would expect that'll only kind of continue as we, approach kind of that final 30-day session for Governor Lujan Grisham.
Yeah, and you did. I wanted to ask you about, too, the possibility of a special session. This has been brought up multiple times. She, right after the session, said, I'm really feeling pretty hot about these issues. I think there's a possibility I could call a special session back for public safety. And legislators have said, well, let's think about this. Let's think about what the outcome would be. And I know you talked to some legislators recently about discussions they've had around that.
Yeah, and I actually got to ask the governor about it last week as well. She had said in that final day of the session press conference that she was going to call them back. She was very, that was right after the shooting in Las Cruces had happened, and she was admittedly, I think, upset about that and upset about the outcome of the session. When I talked to her last week, she said she'd been in contact with some, top-ranking Democratic legislators. Said there'd been some negotiations on the bill, but she kind of seemed to back off a little bit from indicating that a special session was going to be anytime soon. I still think it could happen later this year, but a few legislators I've talked to have said, yeah, let's not repeat the same thing we did last year when, as you mentioned, they had this 5-hour special session where not a whole lot got done. I think Senator Peter Wirth, who's the top Democrat in the Senate, said, let's use this approach of kind of having the interim committees maybe study this issue, especially juvenile crime, which is a complicated issue, and let's study it over the coming months, and then maybe try to come up with legislation for the 30-day session. So we'll see. It's still kind of up in the air, but I think it's a little less certain that a special session will happen at this point. And if one does, I don't think there's a guarantee that the governor's going to get the outcome she's hoping for.
Yeah, and that's not even to mention another special session the governor hinted could happen, which is about healthcare and in response to the federal government's threatening of cutting these major healthcare areas, which a lot of New Mexicans are dependent on. So we haven't heard much on that front. It all depends on what's happening in D.C., right? But there are a few different things to keep an eye on in New Mexico in terms of special sessions.
Yeah, I mean, those will be, I think we'll see what happens with that. I think if there are any reductions, as we've reported before, to Medicaid funding for the state, I mean, that could have a huge budget impact. So I think the governor and legislators are kind of wait and see mode a little bit to see, like you said, what happens on that. But certainly that could be, if there are any reductions, something that the state might have to take action on. Also, wanted to mention, we talked about a few of the bills that were vetoed. Another one that was interesting that we didn't really know what way she was going to go on it, and ended up vetoing a lobbyist disclosure bill that you'd reported on during the session a little bit. And curious, what kind of rationale did she give for that, and what's the plan for legislators who supported that kind of going forward?
Yeah, this was an interesting one. It was really down to the wire. This is the first time in years it's ever actually made it to the governor's desk. Bill sponsors actually described it as almost a fluke because the bill it passed the House and it really got changed. The Senate stripped out all those changes, came back to the House as what it appeared as originally and passed the legislature. But yeah, the governor did end up vetoing the measure. It would have required lobbyists or their employers to file reports disclosing stances on bills they're trying to influence. But the governor in her veto message said some more cleanup work needs to get done on the bill. Definitions need to be defined and timelines need to be adjusted to take into account different things. And it was, the bill sponsors were understandably frustrated that it didn't get past the governor. One of them, Representative Sarah Silva, who's a freshman this year, said it was a bit ironic that nobody could know who lobbied the governor to reject that bill. But they do seem very fired up to continue the push next year, and it seems likely that the governor could put it on her call. She said she looks forward to working with legislators to clean up the bill and get it through. So there does seem potential that it could come through. The League of Women Voters of New Mexico said that they expect the governor to put this on her call. Jeff Steinborn, the senator who has been working on this for years, said he's more fired up than ever to get it through. He's absolutely coming back and reintroducing the bill, and maybe we'll even have more aggressive transparency measures for lobbyists on it. So we'll see what happens in the 30-day. It seems possible it could come up again.
Yeah, and that seems like one of those that could be back and see if they make some of the changes the governor wants or not, and kind of stay tuned on that. We've been talking a lot about the vetoes. Obviously, the governor did also sign a lot of the bills, and a lot of legislators and advocates were disappointed on Friday with the bills that got vetoed, but she did sign, I don't have to do the math, but 80, 85%, something like that, of the bills that were sent to her desk. 160 bills. So, obviously she signed a state budget, which is really important because starting in July is a new fiscal year. So that's really, she signed that. She did veto some provisions from that, that we're still kind of looking into. With the budget bill, she can, what's called a line item veto, where kind of sign the bill, but strike out certain provisions or lines in it. She also signed a big capital outlay bill, and she signed a bill that starting next year will open up primary elections to independent voters without having to change their party affiliation. So that's one that could have a big impact as well. So I think the veto's got a lot of attention, and rightfully so, but she did sign a lot of bills too.
In another money package that she did end up vetoing was the tax package. And this was sort of a scramble at the end of the legislature to get a tax package together. It started off as a bunch of personal income tax breaks for a lot of New Mexicans, paid for by an oil surtax. It started in the House that way. Senate added more measures in, tax breaks for foster parents, healthcare practitioners, local news fund employers, a whole bunch of things, but they stripped out the surtax. So there was no funding mechanism in the package to pay for all of that stuff. It was a lot of back and forth. They finally agreed to slim down on the tax package and push a lot of it off to next year. But the governor ended up vetoing the tax package. Can you talk about her reasoning there, Dan?
Yeah, it was for some of those reasons you mentioned. I mean, she said that it wasn't really sound fiscal policy to pass these changes, but push it off for a year. And, that they should have figured out a way to kind of pay for that in this year's budget or from another revenue source. So, but, she was pointed in her veto message. She told them to do better next year and maybe to start the process a little earlier. Typically the tax package is one of those bills that they hear individual bills during the session, but then at the very end, in the last week or so, they kind of roll them all together into this omnibus package, which, I think has benefits and drawbacks. But, this year we saw that it did get going pretty late. They didn't pass it until second to the last day of the session. And by that time, the budget had already been approved. So it did kind of put them in a bind as far as how to pay for the package. So, we'll see whether legislators maybe change that approach, that strategy a little bit. I did talk to Representative Derek Lenty, who's the chair of the House Tax and Rev Committee. And, he did point out all these provisions in it had been vetted during the session. They'd been talked about. And, but he also acknowledged, it's the governor's prerogative at this point, to disprove it or approve it. And so we'll see. I think they'll come back next year and maybe try to, like you said, on the lobbying bill, also try and approve some of these measures this year that got vetoed in the tax package.
Yeah, and I think it was a really interesting conversation, this idea of budgeting money in future years is not, fiscally responsible to do, especially because we're dependent, we've talked about before, on this oil and gas boom and bust. And on a federal level, we have these drill baby drill policies and a lot of swings in the stock market because of these tariff uncertainties. And that's certainly affected oil barrel prices as well. We've seen them a steep decline in the past couple months, which was brought up in the legislature a little bit. It's not affecting New Mexico too much now, but prices have dropped enough that we're less likely to see new wells come online in the state because it's not profitable anymore because the prices are so low. And knowing how our budget depends on that, it's a little risky to try to allocate money now for future budgets.
Yeah, and that's not a usual approach. I mean, I don't recall seeing that a lot. I mean, occasionally you do have bills that won't take effect for a year or two just to give agencies time to prepare, but usually not kind of spending bills that set to take place, to take effect not for another year. So that was kind of unique, and I think the governor wasn't a big fan of that approach. So I wouldn't expect to see them do that again. But as we kind of talked about, they kind of got themselves in a little bit of a bind, and that was the solution they found to doing it, and didn't end up working out that well, at least in the governor's eyes.
Yeah. Well, it was a crazy session. It was very busy. It was kind of interesting too. It was kind of 30 days in 30 days. And usually the sessions start out kind of a slow rolling, not much is getting done until the very end. But we saw a clear divide of let's get crime and behavioral health packages passed in the first 30 days, and let's get a lot of other things done in the next 30 days. It was a very interesting session.
Yeah, it was really, some people in the roundhouse say session kind of takes on its own personality, and this was a unique one in that regard. Kind of going forward, a lot of these bills that the governor did sign will take effect in June, in mid-June, which is kind of the date that's set. Some will take effect in July when the new budget year starts. And then I think, starting in May, June, we'll start seeing a lot of the interim committees start meeting up again and start ramping up that process and holding hearings, and then start crafting a budget for next year. So we'll probably be following up more on some of these bills as they take effect and kind of see what their impact is and things like that. But the bill signing was kind of the final hurrah a little bit for, this year's 60-day session.
Yeah, it was. And in terms of our podcast, Running Up the Roundhouse, we're still kind of mulling over if we want to continue doing this in the interim, if we want to start it up again next session. If you guys have thoughts, please reach out to us via email or phone. You can find our stuff at abqjournal.com, but our emails are dboyd@abqjournal.com and mgleason@abqjournal.com. We'd love to hear your thoughts and get feedback on this podcast. It was the first time we've tried something like this so regularly during a session.
Yeah, and we hope it's been kind of informative for folks, and we've enjoyed doing it even during the session when it was hard to find time to record the podcast and things were happening. But I think it's another way we can kind of update you on what's happening here at the Roundhouse, and certainly we'll be following up more on social media and in the paper and online with coverage on some of these issues, and kind of getting back to our normal routines, which always takes a little while after the session when we're used to things happening so quickly.
Yes, it is so quiet in the office. I walk in and it's not an overstimulated environment. It's crazy.
Yeah, I think maybe my coffee intake has moderated a little bit, so maybe that's good. But we've really enjoyed it. And like Megan said, hopefully we may be coming back with more podcast episodes, but feel free to reach out to us and contact. And thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for tuning along, especially in our tired session brain interviews. You can find all this content on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. But otherwise, I think that's a wrap.